Hi everyone, and welcome to the exposure triangle lecture video. Let's get started. Now in the previous video, you were introduced to the concept of the exposure triangle as it relates to camera shooting modes. For this video, I want to take a deep dive into what the exposure triangle actually is. In photography, exposure refers to the amount of light that falls on a photosensitive material, and this was either film or digital sensor. Proper exposure is important to make sure that all the details within the scene are not lost. An overexposed photograph is too bright, so features in the light areas of the photograph are not clear. An underexposed photograph is too dark, so features in the dark areas of the photograph are not clear. A perfect exposure means that the light is balanced so that the picture looks exactly like the image that's seen by the naked eye. Exposure is affected by three different camera settings: the size of the aperture, also known as the f-stop, the speed of the shutter, and the ISO of the film or sensor. Each of these settings affects the amount of light that goes into the digital sensor. These settings together are called the exposure triangle because as one setting is changed, the other settings can be adjusted to compensate for the change in light to maintain a consistent exposure. By using these three settings together correctly, photographers can create the perfectly exposed photograph. So let's start with the aperture. The term aperture is used to describe the size of the lens opening, or the diaphragm. Like our eyes, the diaphragm of a camera lens can be adjusted to let in more light or to keep light out. And think about your pupils. When you enter a dark room, your pupil expands, and that lets in more light and helps you see in semi-dark situations. On the other hand, when you enter a bright room, your pupil contracts to keep out some of the light. The reason for temporary blindness when you move from a dark to a light room, or vice versa, is because your eyes need time to adjust. For example, when I walked into my bedroom to check on my baby, I moved from a lighted hallway to a really dark bedroom. And when I first walked in, I couldn't see 2 steps in front of me in the bedroom. It's completely dark. And that's because when I first enter the room, my pupils are small and they don't let in a lot of light. Over time, my brain will figure out, hey, this room is dark, and then I need to expand my pupil. And that's going to let in more light, and now that helps me see. Okay, now I can see the big crib, and I can see the other details that were invisible to me when I first entered. The camera aperture works the exact same way. Light comes through the camera opening, or the diaphragm, towards the film sensor. A ring around the diaphragm, called the f-stop ring, works just like our pupil. It will close or open the diaphragm as needed based on the available light. The brighter the light, the less light is needed to come through to the film sensor, so the smaller the opening that's needed. The size of the diaphragm is called the aperture. Now in the previous slide, I noted that the ring that changes the aperture is called an f-stop. So when discussing apertures, we call them f-stops. Now the thing that can be a little confusing about aperture settings, or f-stops, is that they're actually fractions, but we only say the bottom number. For an example, an f-stop of 2 means an f of 1 over 2. An f-stop of 4 sounds larger than an f-stop of 2 because the number is bigger. But the number is the denominator in a fraction. So the larger the number, the smaller the opening. So an f2 is wide because it's 1 over 2, lets in more light than an f4, which is 1 over 4. An f4 is wider and it lets in more light than an f8. So when you're discussing apertures, remember, the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. The smaller the opening, the less light that gets through, just like your pupil. Now, the important thing about the exposure triangle is that you can change one setting and the others can be compensated for the change in light. The reason that you might change one setting by itself is that each setting in the exposure triangle affects a different property of the picture. Aperture, or f-stop, affects the depth of field in a photograph. The depth of field is simply the area in the photograph that is actually in focus. In portrait photography, the depth of field is often purposely small because we like to have that blur in the background. Notice the background of me in this picture, right? However, if we want to replicate the image that our eyes are seeing, which is the goal in crime scene investigation, we want everything to be in focus as much as possible. So in most cases, crime scene investigators are trying to achieve the highest depth of field possible. In order to obtain a high depth of field, You want a small light opening. Since smaller light openings are achieved with higher f-stop numbers, the rule is that the higher the f-stop, the larger the depth of field. Here is an example for you that shows the differences in f-stop. Both of these photographs are taken of the same image. The one on the left, however, is taken using a small f-stop. As you can see from the lens image, this means that the diaphragm is open to let a lot of light in. In this photograph, the depth of field is shallow, so only the first hat is in focus. The second image is taken with a more narrow diaphragm, and that makes all of the hats come up in focus. For crime scene photography, that's the image we want to achieve. Here's another picture showing this in action. An f4 lets in a lot of light, so the depth of field is very shallow and the area behind the bird is not in focus. Artistic, but not what we want to see because we want to record what the naked eye sees. The larger the f-stop, or the larger f-stop, results in a more narrow opening, which allows for a longer depth of field, and that allows us to see all of the image present in the photograph as in focus. Now that you know what the aperture is about, let's move on to the second part of the triangle, the shutter speed. The shutter speed describes the length of time that the lens is open to light. This is the length of time that the mirror in front of the digital lens is flipped up to allow light to pass directly onto the sensor. There is an important characteristic of shutter speed to be aware of. Shutter speed is also measured on a fraction basis, but these fractions represent a fraction of a second. The longer the shutter speed is open, the more likely that the image can be distorted by movement. Ever had one of those pictures where you go to take the picture, but then you move the camera while you're doing it? And when you look at the camera, your picture has all those weird wavy lines in it? That's because the camera is moving while the shutter is still open. So the lens is still gathering information while the camera is in motion. Our goal as crime scene photographers is to keep the camera still while we take photos. But we can only achieve a certain level of stillness, right? Our bodies are always in motion all the time, from our heart beating, our lungs expanding, and other involuntary muscle movements. So even if we try to hold really still, there are going to be body movements that we cannot consciously control. When you're taking photographs while holding a normal focal length camera in your hands, a normal 50mm camera, you're going to need to use a shutter speed that is at least 1/60th of a second or faster. Faster shutter speeds means that the shutter is open less than 1/60th of a second. So it's like snap, 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 snap. So they would be 1/20th of a second, 1/250th of a second, etc. If you try to take a photograph and the shutter remains open for longer than 1/60th of a second, then your unconscious body movements will create blur in the image. And you'll hear this in the camera. You'll hear open, close. You can actually hear that the open and close, and when it's not fast enough, you know my body movement's going to affect that. Now, sometimes due to low levels of light, a longer shutter speed is needed. In these cases, you're going to have to use a tripod to hold the camera steady so that the camera doesn't move while the shutter speed is open, while the shutter is open and the sensor is exposed to light. Like aperture, changing the shutter speed can affect the image characteristics. Shutter speeds affect movement. A short shutter speed, meaning that it opens and closes the shutter more quickly, can erase motion blur. The shutter speed necessary to capture the motion without blurring the subject is dependent upon the motion itself. For example, you only need a shutter speed of about 1/120th of a second to stop the motion blur from a walking subject. But if that person is running or jogging, you're going to need a slightly faster shutter speed of about 1/250th of a second in order to stop the motion blur. Now, if you're photographing a vehicle that's traveling at 60 miles per hour, you're going to need a lot faster shutter speed, approximately 1/1000th of a second, in order to stop that motion blur. Here on this slide, you can see a series of photographs of a waterfall. When the shutter is open for an entire second, the water droplets become blurred together, and there is no distinct details in the water. By shortening the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, then 1/200th of a second, and then finally in the last photo to 1/800th of a second, the photographer is able to stop the motion of individual droplets in the photograph, erasing all the blur of the water moving in the photograph. On the other hand, there are situations where a long shutter speed is preferred. If the shutter is held open long enough, the elements that are constantly in motion in the photograph can essentially disappear. And what this allows us to do as crime scene photographers is take clear photographs even in bad weather. For example, on the top you can see the photograph taken with a standard shutter speed, about 1/60th of a second. The fast shutter speed stops the motion of the snow, creating virtual noise that can distract or even cover up details in the background. On the bottom, however, is a photograph that's taken at the exact same time, but this time using a slow shutter speed. So the camera opens and then closes. The trick to the weather erasing comes from the fact that the snow, the rain, or other weather particles are in continuous motion in front of the camera. If you hold the shutter open for longer, the snow will move across from the top to the bottom of the camera lens, and the sensor will receive the light from the snow itself as well as the background behind the snow. When the sensor puts the entire image together, the snow, because it's in constant motion, becomes essentially removed from the photograph in entirety. Low shutter speeds can even be used to erase people from the picture. This is something that's in a technique known as painting with light, and we'll talk about that more in our flash photography lectures. But it's helpful to know if you have a scene where it's snowing heavily or raining heavily and you want to get that motion out of your photographs, using a longer shutter speed, which means don't handhold, use a tripod, can actually erase that weather from your images and allow you to get a clear view of what's happening without the interference of the precipitation. The last part of the exposure triangle is the ISO. The term ISO comes from the old film days, but is still used on digital cameras today. The original meaning of ISO referred to the film speed, which was labeled on the film using International Standard Organization numbers, ISO numbers. ISO relates to the sensitivity of the film to light, and now relates to the sensitivity of the digital sensor to light. Smaller numbers, smaller ISOs, mean that the film is not very sensitive, and it will require more light to achieve the same exposure. Higher ISO films are therefore more sensitive to light and require less light to achieve a good exposure. The problem is that ISO for both film and digital cameras affects the image quality. In order to make the traditional film more sensitive to light, the filmmakers used larger crystals to capture the light, and these larger crystals created a grainy quality to the photograph because it wasn't as detailed. The same principle holds true for digital cameras today. In order to make the sensor more sensitive to light, the pixel size is increased so that less light still results in the same exposure. By increasing the pixel size, though, the image quality is now reduced. On digital cameras, this image quality concern is called noise. Notice in this image progression shown on this slide that the text becomes blurry at the higher ISOs, and the contrast between the different elements of the photograph is reduced. The ISO setting is one major advantage of digital cameras compared to traditional film cameras. In film cameras, the entire roll of film had the same ISO. As a result, photographers generally used a low ISO, like 100 or 200, for pretty much all the scenes, because they wanted to obtain as high quality photographs as possible. When faced with an extremely dark situation, the photographer had to rely on the shutter speed and the aperture changes to allow them for the proper exposure. In digital cameras, though, the ISO can be changed for each individual photograph, so photographers can individualize the ISO for a specific image being produced. Digital cameras also have a much larger range of ISOs than traditional film. The ISO numbers shown here, from 80 to 3200, represent a really large range. Traditionally, most film was between 100 and 1600, and 1600 film was really expensive because it was so specialized. In order to get higher or lower ISOs, photographers had to get even more expensive specialized film. However, now, digital cameras come with a really large range of ISO capabilities. For example, the Nikon D700 used in this course allows you to choose ISOs between 100 and 6400, so really sensitive, but also subject to a lot of noise. Here's an illustration of the power of the ISO setting. Both of these images were shot with the same shutter speed and the same f-stop. By changing the ISO from 100 to 1600, the photographs changed from only barely outlining the desk in the room to fully exposing the entire room. However, the 1600 image also shows a lot more noise as a result of the reduced image quality, so it's not as in focus as the ISO 100 picture. So useful for some things, not useful for others. Definitely not for comparison photos. Since exposure is controlled by all three items, you can adjust one item based on your needs as long as you counteract with an opposite adjustment to the other items. For example, this chart here shows you that the ideal exposure for a particular photograph is an f8, a 1/250th of a second shutter speed, and 400 ISO. But now that the photographer knows that, the photographer can start messing with the elements so long as they counteract accordingly. So let's say the photographer wants to create an artistic blur in the photograph, but they still need the photograph properly exposed. To create the artistic blur, they will use a smaller f-stop, which creates a larger opening of the diaphragm, allowing more light onto the sensor, which creates a more shallow depth of field. To maintain the same exposure then, the photographer will adjust the other two settings to compensate. In this second case, which is the middle column, the photographer uses an aperture that's 2 steps brighter than the original settings. This is compensated by going 1 step darker on the shutter speed and 1 step darker on the ISO. In the third example, the third column, the photographer now wants to create motion blur, so they decide to set the shutter speed at 1/30th of a second, which is 3 steps brighter than the original setting. They can now compensate for this increased light by reducing the aperture 2 stops and decreasing the ISO of the film by 1 stop. All of these produce the exact same exposure in the film, but all three are going to give different results in terms of depth of field and motion blur within the photograph. For crime scene photographers, artistic blur isn't something we typically have to figure out how to add, but blur itself is something we often have to consider, particularly the blur of hand-holding our camera. Consider this photograph of a bloody footprint. If this photograph is exposed properly and the camera is fully in focus, then we can actually use this type of photograph to measure and compare the shoe prints without requiring the actual print itself. However, the crime scene photographer needs to know how to adjust the exposure settings at the scene to make sure that they capture an image that would make this comparison possible. For example, let's say this camera meter tells you the best exposure for this shoe print is obtained by a 100 ISO, a 1/30th of a second shutter speed, and an f11. You're hand holding the camera, so you know that 1/30th of a second is too slow, and you're going to end up with a little bit of motion blur in the photograph. And that's a no-go for a comparison photograph. So you decide that you need to have your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second in order to get a clear picture. Since reducing the shutter speed will reduce the amount of light that enters the lens, you need then to compensate by increasing the amount of light either via the ISO or the aperture. In this case, in particular, you want the best quality photograph possible, so you don't want to increase the noise by increasing the ISO. But you don't need a large depth of field because the photograph is mostly 2D anyway, so you can compensate by reducing the aperture 1 stop from f11 to f8, and you don't really have to be worried about depth of field issues because of the photograph itself. So now what you've done is you've correctly balanced the exposure so that the shoe print will stay completely in focus and it will be as detailed as possible with as little noise as possible and exposed correctly for your comparison photograph. All right, well, that's all for this lecture. Thanks for watching, everyone.